Good morning, everybody. There is growing momentum for a school of thought that the most effective way to lift families and entire nations out of poverty is through the targeted support of small and growing businesses, SGBs. We'll be hearing that term a lot today. It's about creating, nurturing, and scaling companies that can create jobs. Jobs, 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 and more jobs. They are the key to eradicating poverty. Today, we are here to celebrate the launch of the annual State of the SGB Sector, a report by ANDE, the Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs. This report is the official pulse on global small and growing businesses. To discuss the report and explore how the future of emerging market entrepreneurship looks like, I am joined by Randall Kepner, the Executive Director of ANDE, and hopefully soon by Laurie Spangler, who is also part of the ANDE Executive Committee. So before we kick off, let me briefly introduce Randall. He has been with ANDE since it was founded 5 years ago. And before joining ANDE, he was the Vice President for the U.S. Council of Competitiveness and also a co-founder of the OTF Group, an international consulting firm that advises regions and nations on how to create a competitive advantage. He's a frequent author and speaker on entrepreneurship based on economic development strategies. It's a pleasure to have you with us here today, Randall.
Thanks, Carlos. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for helping with this launch.
First, since we have a very diverse audience, I wanted to set the stage up and get everybody on the same page in regards to the field of emerging market entrepreneurship. Can you tell us why SGBs are so important? How do they help alleviate poverty?
Sure. Let me actually start by defining SGBs, because some people may not have heard the term, and then why we think they're so important at ANDE. So SGB is a small and growing business, and we define an SGB as a firm that has a minimum of 5 employees and up to about 200 or 250, and critically is led by a growth-oriented management team, so that the intent of that business is actually to grow and not just be a mom and pop or a lifestyle business. You'll see by that definition that it's explicitly meant to be above the size of most, in fact, all micro enterprises, and lower than the size of most businesses that have access to emerging market private equity. So these firms are typically looking for growth capital between $20,000 and $2 million, and it's kind of the sweet spot for companies in most emerging markets that we believe do have the potential to create jobs. And even beyond the job creation, which, as you say, is kind of job number one in terms of economic prosperity creation, we think SGBs are especially important because it's not just any job. These are jobs that are often more equitable in the sense that you find SGBs in rural areas, you find them in urban areas. You find within the SGB sector great opportunities for women entrepreneurs to take the lead and build their companies. And so there's the opportunity to sort of change culture and to really make sure that we're leveraging the 50% of the population in many countries that doesn't typically get the opportunity to be entrepreneurial and add to their own and to the country's prosperity. And many of the SGBs that ANDE members work with are specifically focused on serving the base of the pyramid, on the poorest within those countries, and or addressing specific environmental or social challenges. So in general, we see SGBs as a kind of critical tool for addressing prosperity creation in developing countries, but it's a tool that has not been fully leveraged by the international community.
I really want to get into how come that has not yet happened, but before we get into that, can you comment on how SGBs are different from impact investing, which is a term we hear a lot about? Is it simply a subset of the impact investment space?
Yeah, so from the prism of impact investors, SGBs in emerging markets can be considered a segment or a vertical within impact investing. But for ANDE, we look at it from a different prism. Impact investors are only one important player in a broader movement to support small and growing businesses and emerging market entrepreneurship. So we are promoting a solution, the support of SGBs, that requires not just investors, but also capacity development providers and educational institutions, research institutions. So we think about it as a full ecosystem of players that are necessary. The other way to think about it from our perspective is that we think impact investing is great, but it's just a tool. It's not what we exist to optimize. And to kind of put it one final way, ANDE is not about creating a new asset class. we're about creating a new middle class. And we think we can do that by supporting SGBs, whether or not you call them impact investments or not.
Understood. So in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of changes. SGB is becoming a much more catchy term. The Clinton Global Initiative is focusing on it. The World Economic Forum is focusing on entrepreneurship. Development banks are starting to set up projects. We have USAID getting into the movement. What is happening that is bringing SGB into the forum? Why is it picking up?
Well, I think hopefully it reflects the fact that ANDE as an institution and many of our members have been out in the field and actually making a difference. I think you're right that we are seeing more players. If you look just at ANDE's own growth, we've gone from 34 members when we launched in 2009 to 208 today. That is a reflection of the fact that there is a greater understanding of the value of SGBs, that you're actually seeing more established players using the term. It's really exciting when we see other people saying SGB. We thought we had created a horrible error in creating a new acronym, which is not something that most people appreciate. But increasingly, people do recognize the need to focus on this segment of the SME, the small and medium enterprise activity. And I think a lot of this has been driven by the increased research that we're seeing by groups like Monitor Deloitte and Dahlberg. You mentioned the World Economic Forum. This has led to a better understanding of the challenges that face the SGB sector, and happily more activity to try to address some of those challenges. So it's, I think, again, in sum, a broader recognition and just sort of more spotlight that's been placed on the sector by ANDE members and indeed by the organization itself.
You mentioned research, and as you might know, microfinance has been criticized because there is not such a strong evidence that it's like a silver bullet to alleviate poverty. And in fact, some research indicates that on average its impact is actually zero. And the main claim to fame being that it's not negative. So I was curious if there was any research backing the SGB sector.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is I felt like I had a punch in the gut when I read David Rudman's book, which was the one that famously made that claim, and he's done a lot of that research. Because I'm a fan of microfinance, and it's troubling that it may not have the impact that we thought it would. But I also think that microfinance had the challenge of people claiming it to be a silver bullet, and there's not a silver bullet. SGBs are also not a silver bullet. They are part of the solution to address poverty in emerging markets, and one, as I said earlier, I think needs to be better leveraged. What I would tell you on the research side as it relates to SGBs is there's not a lot. There is a lot of research that relates to SMEs, to small and medium enterprises, but that broad definition typically includes all the mom and pop shops and many larger state-owned enterprise businesses that don't have the intent to grow or are being subsidized by states in a way which is inefficient. Again, in addition to the smaller businesses that don't have any intent to grow. So we are, by definition, trying to identify the businesses within the broader SME segment that are more likely to have positive economic and social impacts. And so we still have to prove the point that serving that particular sector actually does lead to poverty reduction. And unfortunately, using our definition, there's not a lot of research out there, so we're commissioned it. We have an ongoing research initiative. Right now, we've funded 3 academic studies in 3 different parts of the world that are looking at various mechanisms by which SGBs could impact poverty through job creation, through the production of services and products that help the poor. And I'm very hopeful that the impact or the findings of those research studies will show a positive impact. And then the other thing I would simply say is, look, there are 208 organizations ranging from Walmart to Vilgro Industria, small Indian business incubators, along with a bunch of development financial institutions and foundations that believe this. So we want to prove it, but we're convinced already. And we're not going to wait for the academic research to come out to continue our efforts, though we certainly have learned from microfinance, and we're not going to try to make any broad claims about our impact until we get some of those academic results.
Understood. So, Randall, going back to the changes that have happened in the past 5 years, what kind of new players are coming in? Are there new players? In the report, it's mentioned that some multinationals are starting to come in through their CSR mechanisms, but I'd love to hear, like 5 years ago, you've seen the entire growth in this sector. So who do you get to talk to these days that you couldn't possibly talk to in the old days?
Well, I wouldn't have been able to talk to you, Carlos, 5 years ago. You wouldn't have paid attention to us. But besides Kiva, who now happily is focusing more and more on small and growing businesses, so that you are in fact a reflection of the growth of this sector and the potential impact. What we certainly have seen are a lot more investment funds or investment vehicles that have come to the space. So as the report talks about, most of the funds that we've been able to identify have actually been launched over the past 5 years. So 48% of the ones that we actually get to survey, but greater than 50% of the 400 investment funds in the space have been launched in the past 5 years. So you're seeing a lot more interest on the investment side. But in addition to that, as you mentioned, we are seeing more corporations getting engaged in this space. I mean, they've always worked with small businesses. Many of them, like say a Coca-Cola or a Nestle or a Unilever, they have supply chains. But they haven't really been thinking about specific programs to support small business entrepreneurship until the most recent 5 years. So you're seeing a number of new programs there, groups like eBay and SAP, which are supporting entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world from both a philanthropic and a long-term business development process. You've got groups like Partners in Food Solutions, which is a program that was launched by General Mills, but now is a consortia of agricultural companies that are providing technical assistance services to food processors in Africa. So it is a space where there is a greater recognition that coming at it from both a business and a philanthropic perspective, there is an opportunity to make a real difference.
One of the changes I've noticed in the sector is metrics and standards, the development of the IRIS standards and the popularization of how social impact metrics are working. Has this helped a lot in regards to SGBs? How much does social and environmental impact come into play when you are considering working with SGBs?
Well, a couple of different questions there. Let me get at it this way. I think it's absolutely critical for the long-term sustainability of our industry and of impact investing to have some standardized metrics to understand whether you're actually making a difference. So we at ANDE are huge supporters of IRIS, the Impact Reporting Investment Standards Initiative. We are one of the largest, if not the largest node in the network of organizations led by the Global Impact Investing Network that is trying to promote the use of IRIS. We have a full-time staff person who's dedicated to helping our members broadly to develop high quality impact assessment strategies, but that's based upon using the IRIS methodology. But IRIS does not crowd in participants in and of itself. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for having a mature industry where we have belief in the metrics that we are reporting. The hard part is actually getting good quality data from businesses and households on the ground so that we can then make claims leveraging the definitions which the IRIS taxonomy offers. And I think that's where ANDE is now focusing a lot of our efforts, trying to develop methodologies and tools that will allow our members in the broader sector to measure their social and environmental impact in a way which is accurate, but also does not require too much effort on behalf of the businesses or the households that we're trying to get the information from.
Yeah, no. It's a challenge when it's more expensive to get the impact data than it is to create it.
Yeah. And also, just to add to that, the other key point is we don't want to fall into the trap of capturing data just to report results. The real value of this data, as we've been discussing with ANDE and discussing mechanisms at our most recent Metrics and Impact Conference, is how do you get this data and learn from it? What we care about is making sure that the business incubators and the investment funds and the social enterprises themselves actually do a better job because they learn about what their impact is. And that feedback loop is actually, again, much harder than the feedback loop that is simply reporting to investors or reporting to funders.
One last question in this look back period. How far has ANDE come in regards to its goal to create a movement like microfinance? When you were setting out, you were like, I want to build a movement that is similar to microfinance, but that is that is attacking or addressing the needs of small growing businesses. When you look at microfinance, what of the microfinance movement, not the industry, but what things would you like to emulate, like clear business practices, business models, or what would you like to avoid? The lack of standardization and impact measurements, for example.
Yeah. Well, at the high level, I'll answer your question that we haven't come far enough in building this movement, but we are still pleased with our progress. And again, I mentioned the fact that ANDE itself has 200 plus members. I think that's a reflection of the fact that there's a lot of interest. The fact that you would spend your time on this phone call with me is a reflection of the interest that hopefully there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of people who will listen to this Google Hangout, means that we're making some progress. But if you look at just the pure size, the total assets under management that we've been able to uncover related to small and growing businesses in emerging markets is around $5 billion. Microfinance has a gross loan portfolio of $90 billion. So, in terms of just numbers, we're a lot smaller than the microfinance industry. And in terms of recognition globally, people still, on the whole, don't know what SGBs are, though some very important institutions, as we've discussed, now recognize and understand that this is an opportunity to focus on. In terms of learning from microfinance, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No.
Okay. In terms of learning from microfinance, we benefit by coming after their efforts. I think it's been really critical in seeing microfinance that you had the ability to mainstream it and to develop a set of products where institutional investors could participate. We haven't done that yet. We're still in the sort of experimentation phase where a few institutional investors are playing, but it's still sort of new and nascent. And I think we need to develop more products and services that we can find a mass market for as it relates to investing and supporting this sector. And I also think that we do, as you suggested, need to be very careful about the claims that we make and our ability to measure the impact so that we don't get caught in a situation where I read in 5 years that the net impact of the SGB sector has not been negative, because that's not going to satisfy me.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Randall. I'd like to move on and focus a little bit more on ANDE itself and its secret sauce for its growth. I want to understand what product, what services ANDE is providing to its members that it's making such an attractive value proposition for them.
Well, thanks for the question, and I wish that Laurie were here so a member can answer that instead of the guy who's paid to sell the institution. So all y'all listening out there, take what I have to say with a grain of salt. But we actually think we create a lot of value for our members. And in the first instance, it's that we are a place where there is just a ton of knowledge sharing and networking that takes place through our working groups on 7 different issues like women's entrepreneurship, youth entrepreneurship, legal tools for entrepreneurship, metrics and research, capital aggregation. Just a lot of really deep discussions take place. We have our events like the annual conference and our annual London event and our metrics and research conference that allow people to both network and meet players in the space so you can build your own personal networks, but also critically to go deep into these issues so that it's not just a superficial discussion. So a lot around helping our members get better at what they do. And then the other thing that we do, and increasingly will do, is advocate for the space. So we think of ANDE as the fundraiser for the SGB sector. And we need to convince development financial institutions, banks, corporations, foundations, and others with assets that this is an incredible opportunity to make a difference in the world, to help build prosperity for poor people, and to get a financial return. So we think we can do that, and we're doing a decent job.
Randall, I used to work in traditional Wall Street finance, and the amount of sharing that is happening in ANDE boggles my mind. I don't understand why people are so open and what is unique about the community that allows people to share things with so much value.
Well, let me recognize that Laurie Spangler's here. So, Laurie, do you hear us?
I can. I apologize, but I'm glad I was able to plug in before we conclude. So hi there.
So, no, Laurie, welcome. And for our listeners out there, let me introduce Laurie. She's the president and CEO of Include, and she's also part of ANDE's executive committee. Laurie runs a global advisory firm that provides capacity and capital solutions to SGBs. She brings more than 25 years of experience in the sector, so it's really a pleasure to have you here, Laurie. Thank you very much for making time. I understand that you just got off the plane and you're probably still at the airport, so I really appreciate you.
No, and I'm delighted to be part of the conversation.
Laurie's also a practitioner in residence at the University of Oxford. She's at the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship, so she really brings a lot to the table. And I hope I can start directing some questions to you. We were just
yeah, can I jump in on the ANDE question? I think I heard Randall give the opening.
Yes, actually, that's what I was about to say. It's perfect timing because you have so many private sector experience that it's your best position to explain why everybody in this community is sharing so much information, while in normal banking it's like trade secrets. I'd rather die than tell you what I'm working on because you're going to take my bonus away.
Yeah, terrific. I appreciate that. I think there are three primary reasons. One is that the opportunity landscape, which ANDE, of course, has discussed, celebrated, and evidenced, is enormous. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, super. So the opportunity landscape is enormous. So therefore, when you look at this, it's not as if you have to say, my gosh, if I collaborate, I'm giving up a share or a part of the opportunity to someone else. You actually say, gosh, if we collaborate, there's a lot more that we can do to address the opportunity landscape because it's so vast. Secondly, it's the nature of the challenges. And again, I think what ANDE has celebrated is the need for a differentiation of tools, services, and contributions to chip away at the challenges to be able to take advantage of the opportunity landscape. So that's why we have investors, DFIs, government players, policymakers, capacity development practitioners. You need all of that. So it's a combination of the opportunity, vastness, and the need to collaborate on your tools to take advantage and to chip away at the challenges. But I would say the third, and this will make Randall blush, but the third driver, it's really the leadership around the ANDE table. From the beginning, they have set a tone of collaboration, of openness, of sharing. And I think that matters a lot. When you have an industry collection, this is not just people coming up and showing off what they're doing. It's people coming together and really trying to lean in, work together to attend to both the challenges and the opportunities. And that tone has been set by the ANDE management and leadership.
Congratulations to ANDE. I mean, it's so strange for me to see that much collaboration. So let's move on to the second half of the session, and I'd like to focus on the wonderful report that ANDE just produced. I'll first lead with a simple question. It's like, from your point of view, what are the main takeaways from the report? I have my own view on it, and I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to dig deeper, but I want to let you guys shout out and highlight the things, the conclusions that you like the most.
Well, let me take a first cut at that, and then hopefully, Laurie, you'll have some perspective as well after I stop blushing, as you suggest. Look, the first thing I would say that the high-level takeaway is, look, the SGB sector is growing, but we're still a small and growing sector. We think it's important to recognize the growth, but that there is a ton more that we have to do. And there are sort of three areas in particular that we think are important to highlight and to focus on as we go forward. The first is that talent is a real challenge to the overall growth of the sector, that most of the small and growing businesses with whom we work or who our members work don't have access to the talent that's necessary to grow, and that we as a sector need to do more to support that. We need to find ways to get particularly middle management talent to take the plunge to work with these businesses so that they can effectively grow. A second real opportunity that we see, and there's a lot of trends toward this already, but it is the inclusion of female entrepreneurs and using a gender lens to understand and to support small and growing businesses. There is so much opportunity to work with female entrepreneurs in emerging markets that is not being taken place because of cultural reasons, because of the lack of financial support, and we think through the work of our members, there's a great opportunity to do more of this. And then finally, that sort of reflects those two a little bit, is that we need to think about solutions that reflect a full ecosystem perspective. So it can't just be the investment side or just the capacity development side or frankly just a gender lens effort. It's got to be something which brings together a variety of players within the context of specific regions in order to actually grow the industry. So in all of those areas, we talk about sort of examples that various institutions are doing to try to address them. And what Andy wants to do and sort of promote through the report is sort of data behind that as well as the overall view of the sector.
So maybe I would just add on a bit. I think for me the fundamental takeaway is a change in the conversation. So I really welcome how Randall has positioned the paper that it's no longer can we make the case. Let's have a dialogue or debate about SGBs and the role of SGBs in the broader economic development dialogue. It's actually now what do we really do to empower and strengthen those SGBs. So I just think the tone, the nature, we're kind of drawing a line in the sand. It's no longer a debate. It's now let's get down to brass tacks and let's focus on the SGBs. So within that context, I would say two, and very similar to Randall's. One is just the underpinning of the recognition of its capacity and capital. I mean, I know there's broader enabling environment, but fundamentally recognizing both, I would say, from the funder side as well as from the SGB operational side. I think sometimes the conversation previously has broken down to SGBs need capacity and capital. But truthfully, the funders, whether they are asset managers or financial institutions of any kind, DFIs or commercial banks, they also need capacity interventions to really determine what is the right product suite, how do you tailor your product and service to meet the real needs of the SGBs. So I think framing the capacity and capital conversation, both through the supply side, if you will, as well as the demand side, is a very important takeaway from the report and a highlight. And the further, I would say, similar to the gender lens, or using that as an example, we do a lot in the area of gender lens, activity, investment, and capacity building, and welcome that. But I think it's representative of additional lenses that we could utilize. So I think it's an example of how to apply a little bit more specialization through a sector or other points of differentiation that allow us to be more effective in delivering the capital and capacity to the SGBs. So those would be my takeaways. Hello? Can you hear me still?
I got you, Laurie.
Okay.
Carlos, are you there, my friend?
Good. I don't know. I'm not saying that's what's going on.
Carlos?
Carlos thinks we froze.
Okay.
I know.
All right, and then, well, Randall, up to you. Oh, there he is.
Carlos, there you are.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? I hope so.
Now we can.
Yes, I can see my little red green bar going up and down. I am back. Great. No, I was just agreeing with Laurie's point. Perfect. So one area of the report that stood out for me was simply, despite all the changes in the industry, a very fundamental area has not been fixed, which is there is capital out there, but the capital providers cannot identify investment-ready SGBs, and at the same time, the SGBs themselves cannot access the capital to grow. So I'm curious to what new solutions are you guys excited about for the ability to SGBs to access capital?
Randall, can I jump in on this one?
Yeah, please.
So I think one of the developments that's been very effective, and we're only beginning to see the benefit of this, is really breaking down stage of life of a company and really understanding better where they are in that growth and development cycle, and then therefore aligning the type of capital they need, the amount of capital they need, and the terms and conditions of that capital with the stage of life of the business. A few years ago, there was the very thoughtful report that came out by Deloitte Monitor with Acumen about the blueprint, validate, prepare, and scale stages. You can use different words to describe stages, but I think we all understand that there are qualitative and quantitative differentiation points as a company moves through those stages. And the criticality, I believe, is the alignment of capital to meet the needs at those different stages. So the good news here, Carlos, I would say, is that we are beginning to see funds, fund managers, banks, DFIs understand that and actually be more straightforward in saying, what is my appetite? Not everybody has the appetite for the blueprint and the validate stage. That's fair enough. But then they should be clear about that. So we're not also wasting time. SGBs don't have a lot of time to knock on doors and look for capital. So I think the clarity of what I'm looking for as an investor and what my appetite truly is for the stage of life of the business, in addition to the sectoral specialization, I think has been a very significant development. I'll just give you one example. We recently convened about 2 weeks ago in the digital financial services sector a roundtable of investors. And these investors, 12 investors around the table, that really got into this very specific issue. And we came out of that 6-hour working session with a deep understanding of how these investors can also even work between and among each other by seeding and then inviting later stage investors to come into that particular sector of digital financial services in a much clearer, I think, much more effective way to allocate capital. So I think it's no longer about, I'm not aware of who's out there. I think it's all about the alignment and the specificity of appetite at different stages of business.
If I could just add a little bit to that, Carlos. Building on Laurie's points, what we find is that it is most challenging to get funding for what we now call the most missing part of the missing middle. So the $20,000 to $250,000 level. It is particularly challenging for SGBs at the seed and startup phase to get access to capital, because in most emerging markets there are not angel funds, there are not a lot of friends and family money, there are not access to capital from banks that could serve in that role. And so we are excited, and the report goes into this, to see that there has been some progress in seeing more funds and vehicles that are starting to focus on that level, but it is still far too little. And it also reflects the fact that many of the businesses at that stage will not be well served by a pure equity investment. There is still a need for blended capital. And in particular at the earliest stages, for even some grant capital, for pure philanthropic dollars to help address some of the kind of core capacity development needs that many of these SGBs have. So it, as Laurie sort of suggested, it requires, and we're seeing, a greater recognition of the stages and what types of capital support are needed by stage. But the good news is, I think that there is a greater recognition of that, and we're seeing more funds, more vehicles, more capacity development efforts that recognize it.
No, I think it goes back to Laurie's point of funders also need capacity, and the recognition that there's so many stages of capital and so many places, types of capital, and amounts of capital that need to be deployed according to each stage of the SGB, that realization and seeing that growth in the sector is actually quite promising. I'd like to move on to another area of the report. And actually, I think it was one of the most ambitious comments in the report in regards to the ecosystems. The need for SGBs to leverage metropolitan partners, banks, local educational institutions, government, physical infrastructure. I mean, these are really big problems that I'd love to hear how you guys believe these local entrepreneur ecosystems come about, and how can one help accelerate their formation?
I'll take the first cut at that, Laurie, if you'd like, and then jump in, please.
Sure.
Look, at a theoretical and practical basis, we recognize and believe fully or strongly that to really help an entrepreneurial system grow, you have to think about multiple players in the context of a particular geography. One of the things that is incorrect about the way that most organizations go about supporting entrepreneurship is thinking you could do so at a national level. Think about India. Think about the United States. Think about Kenya. These are massive countries where the environments in which entrepreneurs work, do their business, are different from community to community. It is not the same to be in Nairobi as it is in Nakuru. So we first are trying to make this point that you need to think about the regional geographies, typically at a metropolitan level, in order to really target whatever sorts of entrepreneurial programs that you want to have. So you ask the question, well, how do they form and how do you accelerate? Well, an entrepreneurial ecosystem exists or it doesn't, right? Because of the existence of whatever exists in terms of the businesses that are there, the entrepreneurial support organizations that are there, the funds that are there, the banks and their willingness to support. In most emerging market contexts, they are weak ecosystems for entrepreneurial support. And given that, what Andy believes is it's important to start building the network of players that can help strengthen those. So again, the same kinds of members that are parts of Andy, so banks, investment funds, capacity development providers, investors, foundations, government entities, so that they focus their efforts in a collective way within a particular area. And what Andy wants to do is to try to play a role to help convene those players so that they can develop comprehensive and holistic efforts. And this perspective happily is being embraced by a number of development financial institutions and other funders that I'm happy to go into. But we are out on a mission to try to provide and to promote this particular perspective.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, I think Randall's spot on right. It is about the local environment and the presence and the gathering and integration of the players on a regular, ongoing basis. I mean, the tools and instruments to do that, the convenings, and obviously Andy is an example of that, and as people I think appreciate and certainly can read in broader Andy information, is the move to have regional chapters of Andy is part and a demonstration of the power of that, and we debated it around the Andy table. If we're trying to shine a spotlight on this sector and develop an ecosystem globally, the only modality for doing that truly effectively is at the local level. And so we try to reflect that even in our own work at Andy. So I fully agree with Randall. I think the exciting thing also is that different funders and larger players are recognizing that, and they're also acting upon that initiative and conviction. So as Randall mentioned, generally the DFIs are seeing that, and specifically what we're witnessing then in their program design and how they're allocating their technical assistance dollars is they're looking at ecosystem interventions, meaning that as they design the program, first of all, they're asking people like Andy to think about the design of this. Terrific, right? We want to see Andy as an informed partner in those initiatives. And then in the execution of it, they are looking at how do we attend to the BDS providers, the capital providers, the SGB providers, the policymakers. They're actually embedding those roles in the rollout of the program. And I think that is a fundamental shift from even a year ago, let alone 5 years ago.
Thank you both. I'd like to leave the last few minutes of this conversation to talk about the future. And I'll actually bring in one of the questions that was shared by the community. How could each of us take some time to help? Online workshops, raise awareness of SGBs in emerging markets. There's a community out there who'd like to help. What can they do to participate in strengthening the SGB community?
Let me take a first shot at that. Look, I think building on Laurie's comments and my previous comments, from the Andy perspective, what's next is a real deep focus on regions. We need to strengthen our own regional chapters so that they can in turn become relevant players in efforts to build the local ecosystems that need to be developed. And so we want to see more programmatic work taking place where we are helping with the issues of talent, as we are hoping to do in East Africa, and studying women's entrepreneurship as we are in the country of Mexico, focusing in a few geographic regions there. But we become relevant on the ground, and we become a real force for helping the local institutions and the international institutions with local offices come together to address whatever the specific challenges are in those particular regions. So we want to get more granular, more in the weeds, in playing that role and seeing those initiatives emerge in localities, municipalities, regions around the world. So I think that's a major area of activity for us. And to the question at hand, look, if you are an individual, particularly an individual who is based in an emerging market, get involved, whether it's with Andy or it's the local Chamber of Commerce or local entrepreneurial incubators that need access to mentors. And there's such a great need on the talent side, and mentorship can be a critical part of that. So there are tons of opportunities to get involved, and certainly interacting with Andy, even if you're not a member, we would love to help you find ways of engaging in the sector.
Yeah, and I would just put a point on the ANDE role here, not so much only as being members, although we would welcome that, but ANDE is trying to serve as a platform for gathering those very granular examples of success, as well as just lessons learned and insights, because if we are getting involved, it's hard work, we're at it, we're very busy, we're practitioners, and I think the power of connecting the dots across and between us as practitioners is critically important. So I do, and I love the fact that ANDE has developed its capability to be that central repository of lessons, of knowledge, and makes it available in an incredibly generous and collaborative way, Carlos, as you were acknowledging earlier on in the conversation. So I would say get involved locally for sure, reinforce Randall's point. The mentorship should not be underestimated. And one subject we touch upon in talent, I think the big aha about the talent support is that it's not just technical expertise that people need, it's general management support. General management skills. So if you have a business, you have been a business owner operator, there is a heck of a lot you can add and contribute to anyone in an entrepreneurial chair, even if you don't have the technical sector specific understanding of the subject of their business. So I would not use that as an impediment or a reluctance. So the talent engagement, wherever you can find that opening locally, but I would say look across what's happening in different geographies, and the most efficient way to do that is via ANDE.
Guys, one last question. 5 years from now, where would you like to be? What will success for Andy, what will success for this industry look like? I'm imagining a lot of regional hubs, extremely localized chapters, but I'd love to hear from you what success will look like. What does success look like for you guys, and where do you think you'll be in 5 years?
Well, my initial response to your answer is in 5 years I'd like to be sitting on a beach somewhere, take a vacation. But maybe I can't do that unless we get to the place where we're not talking about only $5 billion of assets under management, but it's 25 or $50 billion of assets under management. But those numbers are a little less important to me than what you were suggesting, Carlos, which is I would like to be able to look out and critically point to a half a dozen places in the world where we see strong and thriving entrepreneurial environments where we understand the mechanisms that were in place to drive that growth. So can we learn from, let's say again, a half a dozen regions where there have been significant ecosystem efforts, learn about what kinds of financial instruments are necessary, what kinds of incubators and accelerators actually work, what kinds of talent programs make a difference, so that we can say, look, this is a model that can be replicated not over just 5 years, but over the next generation, to do this not in 6 places, but all throughout emerging markets. So it really is about the building strategies and replicable programming that can impact regional entrepreneurial ecosystems. If we do that successfully over the next 5 years, I'll take that vacation.
And a terrific response and definition, Randall, and I would just add 2 comments to support that. One would be, I really hope that SGBs in 5 years are completely understood as the dynamic segment driving economic development across the globe. There's been a lot of improvement in the definition and clarity and the understanding, but even as the report suggests, there's more that we could do. So 5 years on, I just want to see it. It's the underpinning of so much of what we want to see, not just in economic development, but in inclusivity and equitable participation in local economies. And I do think that will manifest itself in all kinds of benefits, tangible and intangible. But I'd like to see that just more clearly understood. Implications that would be, in fact, as you look at funders, investors, and the like, a significant, if not majority, amount of their portfolio, whether it's loans or equity investments, guarantee instruments, or other forms of human and technical assets would be represented by SGBs. That it's almost the default. It's there and visible. And the second, I would say, Andy, from looking at it, as an EC member, I want to think about Andy 5 years on. I think that Andy is certainly 5 years seen even more than it is today as the go-to voice. It's a voice for SGBs and the lessons, the knowledge, the insights, and the power of SGBs. And I'd like to see that in an even more robust form than it is today.
Laurie, Randall, our time is up. Thank you so much for your wonderful conversation. And thank you, Andy, for the wonderful report. For all those who are listening, I strongly recommend you take a look at it. If you want to see more specific examples of all the things that we talked about, and particularly about the countries that have the most potential for creating these local ecosystems for SGBs, it's all in the report, so please take a look. Thank you very much for coming in today.